Are guns to blame?
Are guns to blame for what? Well, we've been watching NBC, CBS, and ABC nightly lies, which they call nightly news. Or, if you've been reading the Los Angeles Times or the New York Times, any of the major metropolitan newspapers, or for that matter, Time Magazine or Newsweek, any of the national weekly magazines, you know that an attempt is being made right now to blame guns for crime. That statement, guns cause crime, is the basic pitch of the communists, and I do mean communists, and their allies in America. Now, the reason they're trying to convince you that guns cause crime is that the communists know if they can convince you that guns cause crime, or more importantly, if they can create the impression that most people believe, in the cities especially, that guns cause crime, the next step is fairly simple. The communists and all of their allies will masquerade as crime fighters. And then they will tell you, if there were no more guns, there'd be no more crime, or that crime would be greatly reduced. In other words, what they're selling you is gun control under the label of crime control. Now, ladies and gentlemen, those are not the same things. Look, if you're going to control crime, you do so by controlling or eliminating criminals. That's easy enough. Now, you can see this right away if you ask yourself, what is a high crime area? Now, don't go ask some professor, because if you do, he's going to try to convince you that a high crime area is where they get poverty and disease and poor Negroes, poor white people. This sociological nonsense. No. A high crime area is an area where they've got lots of criminals on the street. And you can see this right away if you ask yourself, what is a low crime area? A low crime area is an area where you have very few criminals on the street. So if you want to take a high crime area and turn it into a low crime area, get the criminals off the street. And conversely, if you want to take a low crime area and turn it into a high crime area, just keep turning loose the criminals. Control crime, you do so by controlling or eliminating criminals. Now, there are two methods of doing that. The first method doesn't really involve dealing with criminals. It involves dealing with law-abiding citizens, so to speak. Look around you. Now, look at the people in this room. We are not criminals. Now, it should be obvious to you that if everybody in the city behaved toward each other as we behave toward our fellow men, there wouldn't be any crime. Now, the reason for that is that we are responsible for our actions and the results of our actions. We respect the rights of other people. We exercise self-control, self-restraint. We have freedoms, but we know that with each freedom we've got, there comes a corresponding responsibility. So the first method of dealing with crime doesn't involve dealing with criminals at all. It involves duplicating ourselves. If we can get other people to behave toward the fellow citizens the way we behave, we eliminate crime. So that the first method of dealing with crime is in dealing with children. What you do is take little children when they're in the home, and you raise them up in the way you want them to go. And when they grow up, they won't stray from the path. That's fairly easy to do. You build a strong moral code. You tell a child what he's to do and what he's to not do. You teach him to respect authority. If the father says, Johnny, do this, and Johnny refuses, you're supposed to spank him. If he refuses again, you spank him again. If he refuses a third time, you kick him. The point is that he has to learn to respect authority. He has to learn that water will surely wet you and that fire will surely burn you. He has no knowledge at first, but as he grows older, he has more freedom. He has more responsibility because he acquires judgment. As he gets 15, 16 years old, he's practically free to do whatever he wants. But he knows that he's responsible for his actions and the results of his actions. In other words, individual responsibility. He begins to exercise self-control, self-restraint. He knows that if he throws a rock through the neighbor's window, he can't come back and say, well, Joe told me to do it. Joe's not responsible. The man who threw the rock is responsible. And he's held responsible by the parents for what he does. Now, it says in the Bible, if you spare the rod, you'll spoil the child. That means, of course, that you build a strong moral foundation. You force the child to obey you. As the child grows older, he can be completely free, but he does have self-control, and he exercises individual responsibility. But I want you to notice something. Exactly the opposite is happening in America today. Instead of children being taught to accept responsibility and to respect authority, to exercise self-control and respect the rights of other people, they are being taught instead to challenge authority, to accept no responsibility, to shift the blame to someone else, and they are being taught essentially that there is no right and no wrong. This is true whether it's in the churches, in the homes, where children were victimized by Benjamin Spock and the permissiveness for years. And the net result is that the children, as they get older, instead of being responsible adults, are now becoming involved in crime. In America today, more than half the serious crime is committed by people under 25 years of age. That's because of the weakening of the moral foundation. So the first method of controlling crime is to deal with young people and bring them up right, to duplicate ourselves. If we fail in that, we have a different problem, because children grow up and they go out and break the law, some of them. If that happens, you are supposed to hold the individual responsible for his actions and the results of his actions. And since this person is an adult and has committed a crime, you're supposed to punish him for his crimes, and you're supposed to make the punishment fit the crime. Now, if that means putting back in the death penalty, extending it to different categories, trying men for their crimes, and after a conviction and an appeal, carrying out the sentence, if that's what it means, it's what we're going to have to do. But we cannot sit back and allow crime to flourish in America. But as you've noticed, exactly the opposite is happening. Instead of criminals being held responsible for their actions, the blame is being shifted over to society, or to the economic conditions, or to race or religion. Exactly the opposite. And the net result is we've got a crime wave in this country. But I want you to notice that there are two methods of controlling crime. The first, to teach children basic morality, and the second, to punish criminals for their crimes, get them off the streets. That's crime control. I didn't say one word about guns, not one word. And that's because crime control is not the same thing as gun control. What is gun control? Well, in one sentence, gun control is government control of people. If you're going to discuss gun control, you would have to discuss ways and means, methods, by which governments disarm the populations. Gun control essentially is people control. Now, my contention is that this administration, which has been the same one for some 40 years now, has involved itself in a conspiracy to enslave us. This is because before you can enslave a population, you must first disarm it. So we ask a question. What is the difference between our condition in this country and the condition of the people living in China, or living in Russia, or Poland, or any of those communist countries? What is the difference? Oh, you would tell me, well, we can go where we want to go, do the things we want to do, and in spite of all the government tampering and interference with our lives, we still pretty much are free to strike our own bargain with life. And of course, they are not. In fact, if they try to leave, it's treason, and they're executed for it. So you would say the difference between the American people and the people living under Fidel Castro is that we are free, and they are not. Oh, everybody would agree with that. That doesn't answer the question, though. So we ask another question. What is the basic difference between a free man and a slave? If you ask that question, you'll get the answers. Because there have been free men throughout all of history, and there have been slaves throughout all of history. So what is the difference? Well, that difference, my friends, is that throughout all of recorded history, free men either have the means or can readily acquire the means to protect their lives and their property, and slaves, no matter where you find them, never can. That's the basic difference. And it doesn't matter how far back in history you go, it doesn't matter which corner of the globe you go to. That distinction between freemen and slaves has existed since the beginning of time. Go back to Rome, for instance. Next time you see a movie made about the persecution of the Christians in Rome, and you see maybe 20 or 30 Roman soldiers, and they're herding Christians into a Colosseum to be eaten by lions or killed by gladiators. Next time you see one of those movies, and you say to yourself, how in the world is it possible for a handful of soldiers to push those people into a Colosseum to be butchered? You take a good look and see who's got the spears. The soldiers had spears, clubs, knives, whips, and swords. And the victims? They neither had the means, nor could they acquire the means to protect their lives and their property, and that's why they were butchered. But you say, oh, that was a long time ago, that was 2,000 years ago. Things have changed. No, my friends, nothing has changed. The difference between freemen and slaves has been the same throughout all of recorded history, and it is the same today. Come to modern times, leap across the centuries. You come to this country. There was slavery in this country at one time. It was a far less extensive form of slavery as exists in communist nations and modern dictatorships. The next time you see a movie made about slavery in this country, you'll see some guys in the field working, maybe 30, 40 slaves in the field working in the hot sun. And you see a couple of guys on horseback keeping those people out working in the hot sun. And you say to yourself, how in the world could a couple of men on horseback keep those people out there in the field working in the hot sun? Take a good look and see who's got the guns. If you think anything has changed, come to modern times. You know, I had a fight about this once. My basic belief is that anybody who doesn't learn from history is doomed to repeat it. And I do believe that people who have experience with slavery, or people who claim that their relatives had experience with slavery, should understand what's taking place. Now, I say this because I have many debates with liberals. I ran into one who was a Jewish fellow, and he was in favor of gun control. And I couldn't quite understand his attitude. After the experience of the Jews in Germany, I couldn't understand his attitude. So I said to him, I said, tell me something. How many Jews were armed when Hitler put them in the ovens? And he said, well, that's a silly question. I said, then give me a silly answer. How many were armed? He said, all right, none. I said, one more question. How many Jews would have gone in the ovens if they had been armed? He said, that question doesn't make any sense. I said, it makes sense to me. I want an answer. How many Jews would have climbed in the ovens if they had been armed? He said, just doesn't make any sense. I said, why not? He said, well, what could they have done with rifles and handguns and shotguns against those German soldiers? I said, they could have shot the soldiers. Don't tell me that the Jews are a bunch of gingerbread men wanting to climb into somebody's oven. It's not that way. They neither had the means, nor could they acquire the means to protect their lives and their property, and so they lost both. That difference between freemen and slaves has existed throughout all of recorded history. You see, the slave masters always disarm the population, and then they make certain that the population, that the citizens, can never acquire the means to protect their lives and their property. You can see this in history if you'll study the history of slave revolts. And what you're going to discover is that slaves were always trying to find ways to accumulate some weapons. And every time throughout history that the slaves were able to accumulate a sufficient number of arms, there was always a slave uprising. And they tried to kill or get rid of the slave masters. It's been this way throughout all of history. Nobody wants to be a slave. The difference between free men and slaves is that free men either have the means or can readily acquire the means to protect their lives and their property, and slaves never can. And you might make a note here that God gave everyone the right to protect his life and his property against crime and criminals, whether the criminal appears as an individual, in a group, or in the government. In Russia, the citizens still have the right to protect their lives and their property, but the government has deprived them of the means. See, you still have rights here, but if you haven't got the means, you're going to slavery. Now let's look here. Look backwards at history, and you'll see some outstanding characteristics, some features of past dictatorships, and they're characteristic today. Look at the sociology of mankind. What you're going to discover is that in all countries, no matter where you look, the great majority of people, the 99% of the population, has been no different than ourselves. What is it you want? Well, what I want is to be left alone to live my life as an individual American. I don't want to be pushed around by individuals, by groups, or by governments. I should like to live my life to be more worthy of the God or gods which I worship, and the same thing is true of you. It's simple enough. That's the 99% of the people in every country, no matter where you find them. But always, in every country, there's a tiny fraction of people, oh, perhaps 1%, considerably less than 1%, who, for whatever reason, feel that it's their duty or their right to push or trample on the rights of other people. Now, these people, this tiny fraction, has been classified as criminals, and rightly so. But throughout history, there have been two kinds of criminals. There always have been two kinds, and there always will be two kinds. The two kinds of criminals, of course, are dumb criminals and smart criminals. And there's a world of difference between the two. You can characterize a dumb criminal by the fact that the dumb criminal wants to make the individual the victim of his crime. So the dumb criminal are the guys who go around and rob banks, they rape, pillage, burn, murder. These are dumb criminals. The target is the individual. The smart criminals become politicians. And this is because the smart criminals don't try to victimize the individual citizen. The smart criminals try to victimize the entire population. The smart criminals always organize. They go to government, and they take control of the government. Julius Caesar was a smart criminal. So was Adolf Hitler. Now, I'm sure in Germany in the 1930s, there had to be some rapists running around. There had to be a few murderers running around. There were some arsonists and some muggers running around. Do you think Adolf Hitler spent his time going out trying to rip off the ordinary citizen? Adolf was a politician. He and his friends were organized. They got control of the government and put everybody in slavery. That's the way this con game works. The dumb criminals make the individual the victim of crime. The smart criminals become politicians, and then they find ways and means to accumulate more power in the government, finally disarming the population, and they put them all in slavery. It's been that way throughout all of man's history, and it's no different today. Now, my contention is that the smart criminals and dumb criminals do exactly the same thing. The difference being that one operates in the government. So let's look at dumb ones and smart ones and see what we see. Al Capone, the man who supposedly organized the mafia, was the smartest of the dumb criminals. And apparently Gerald Ford, the dumbest of the smart ones. You remember what Al Capone did? Let's take an example of a mafia-type operation. He wanted the businessmen to give him some money, but they wouldn't do it. So Capone, being the smartest of the dumb criminals, at least saw the value in organization. But still, his target was the individual businessman. He had limited views. And what did Capone do? Well, he hired him some guys. Now, these were all criminals. Al Capone, who was the boss, and everybody who hired, these were criminals. He divided these guys into two different sections. He had some bad criminals and some good criminals. That is to fit the image of the people had of criminals. Now, what did the bad criminals look like? Well, the bad ones were great big guys, 6 feet 8 inches tall, big, broad shoulders, sloping foreheads, maybe even a hump on their back, looking like Boris Karloff and Lon Chaney Jr. For those who don't know, they played the Wolfman and Frankenstein in the movies with very little makeup. Their physical appearance was threatening. These were the bad ones. The good criminals had to appear harmless. So they were nice and slim. Oh, 5'9", 5'10" inches tall, 160 pounds, wearing pinched up suits. They looked just exactly like, they looked like lawyers. Now, how did he operate? Well, Al Capone sent these big guys around to see the businessmen. They'd walk into a store, Say a delicatessen, they say, all right, Saul, give us $50 or we're going to beat your head in. And Saul would look up and say, get out of here. I'm not going to give you my money. I'll call the cops. And about that time, pow, he'd knock him down there. Stomp on him. Bust up all the counters, chase away the customers. These big criminals, these two big guys, would go on a rampage like bulls in a china shop. Then they would leave. Now, all this commotion would attract the attention of other people, in particular, other businessmen. They'd come over to find out what happened. They learned these two big guys had been there and beat up Saul. There he was on the floor, all beaten up. These two big guys would then go on the other side of town. And they repeat the performance. They walk into a barber shop. They say, all right, Luigi, give us $50 or we're going to beat your head in. And Luigi would say, I'm not going to give you my money. I'll call up and pow, he'd knock him down and stomp on him. They'd turn over the chairs and bust up the store and chase the customers away. They'd rampage again like bulls in a china shop. Then they would leave. They'd repeat this process, apparently at random, in different sections of the city. And pretty soon, the businessmen began talking amongst themselves. What were they talking about? Well, who's going to be the next victim? They became frightened. The businessmen began behaving as a class. Now, that is the first element of communist-style warfare, to create class consciousness. Because as soon as people become aware of themselves as a class, they're ready to be victimized. So what happened? The businessmen talked amongst themselves. They were frightened. Of course, they needed protection. Just about that time, here come these good criminals, the ones with the pinched-up suits on. They'd walk into a store and they'd say, hey, Joe, we hear you got trouble. And Joe would say, yeah, some big guys. The little criminals would say, well, Joe, look, we heard about your problem. Look, we come to protect you. See, we got these big rods here. Criminals always had them big guns, you see. Look, give us $5 a week. And we'll stand guard out here. We'll patrol the street. And if those big guys come around, we'll blast them. We're here to protect you. Well, you know what the net result was. The net result was that the businessmen began paying Al Capone $5 a week so that he could solve a problem which they wouldn't have had if he had made it in the first place. It was called a protection racket. But you see what the secret was? The secret was that those bad criminals, the ones who appeared to be bad, and those good criminals, the ones who appeared to be good, were simply two arms on the same hairy body. And undoubtedly, some of the businessmen in the business community were, in fact, in the mafia. And the reason they were in there was to provide the false leadership for the other businessmen to make it easier to pay off Al Capone than to fight him. Take the easy way out. Pay $5 a week. They were Judas goats. Always worked this way. Now, that was a protection racket. The citizens, the businessmen, parted with some money which they would not ordinarily have parted with. Al Capone simply wanted the money, which he got. But he got it by creating a problem with one hand and advocating a solution with the other. Now, protection rackets are the same no matter who works them. And smart criminals in our government are working a protection racket against the entire population. Before we look at how this protection racket takes place, how they actually operate it, let's look at the Second Amendment. Because in this case, we are supposed to hand in our firearms to the government, all of them. Whether it's one at a time, one class at a time, or just all at once. We are supposed to hand in our firearms to the government, and they're going to give us security. Well, they've got security in prisons and concentration camps, maximum security, but there's no freedom. In other words, these smart criminals in our government make Al Capone look like a piker. How does it work? Let's look at the Second Amendment. Because people never lose their freedom. They never surrender their liberty unless it's under some delusions. So the communists have created certain delusions about the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment reads as follows: a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This seems clear enough. That means the federal government cannot pass even an eensy-beensy law dealing with firearms. That's an infringement. Because the founding fathers knew that if they could pass an eensy-beensy law today, they could pass a teeny-tiny law tomorrow. Add up all the eensy-beensies and teeny-tinies, and you got the whole thing. That's the way this game works. So they were telling the federal government to keep their cotton-picking hands off our firearms, period. The right shall not be infringed. But the communists and their allies operating through our government want to disarm the American people. So they've created certain delusions about the Second Amendment. They've told lies about it. We'll examine just two of those lies. And I think you can see the smoke screen thrown up by the communists and their allies to deprive us of our firearms. The first and the biggest lie told about the Second Amendment, and the one you should all recognize, is that the Second Amendment was designed to protect the rights of hunters, sportsmen, and target shooters. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Second Amendment has nothing at all to do with hunting, sportsmanship, and target shooting. The reason the communists are promoting that lie is because they know if they can convince enough of the American people to stand up for the Second Amendment on the basis of hunting, sportsmanship, and target shooting, the communists know that that position will lead to a compromise. That's the eensy-beensy law, to be followed by the teeny-tiny law, until they got the whole thing. For a moment, that you've been victimized, and you're doing the right thing but for the wrong reasons. You're standing up for the Second Amendment, but on the basis of hunting, sportsmanship, and target shooting. The first thing you recognize is that by attacking hunters, sportsmen, and target shooters, you cause those people who identify to tend to band together, to join an organization to protect the interests of hunters, sportsmanship, and target shooting. Target shooters. This is a natural phenomenon. Now, the idea is once you create this class of people, they can be branded as a so-called gun lobby, to be victimized. But I want you to notice that the Constitution does not recognize classes. We all have exactly the same rights. So the first thing you see is that a small segment of the population has been isolated and called the so-called gun lobby. And therefore most Americans don't feel that they're part of this gun lobby. It was intended that way. Now let's pretend that we're watching a televised debate between a spokesman for the gun lobby, what might be called the gun lobby, a responsible spokesman, you see, and over here is Mr. Liberal. You're watching television. Here's the great white hunter. He's going to stand up for the Second Amendment on the basis of hunting, sportsmanship, and target shooting. On this side is Mr. Sly Liberal. What happens? There's a moderator. The moderator turns to the great white hunter and says, Mr. Hunter, why do you support the Second Amendment? He says, by God, he says, my granddaddy fought in the Civil War. My pappy hunted. I'm a hunter. Taught my boy to hunt. I'm a legitimate user of firearms. You can't take away my rights. And boy, he really stands up for the Second Amendment because he's a hunter, a sportsman, and a target shooter. He feels his rights are being threatened as a hunter, a sportsman, or a target shooter. He has done the right thing. That is, he stood up for the Second Amendment. But he did it for the wrong reasons. He's been had, only he's too dumb to know it. The moderator then turns to Mr. Liberal. Says to Mr. Liberal, well, where do you stand? Now, Mr. Liberal, of course, is either from the ACLU, the National Council of Churches, or the League of Women Vipers. Now, what happens here? The moderator turns to Mr. Liberal over here and says, where do you stand on the Second Amendment? And he's smiling with that Cheshire cat grin. He says, well, first, let me assure Mr. Hunter, the great white hunter, that nobody is in any way trying to take away the rights of hunters, sportsmen, and target shooters. Nobody wants to curb the legitimate uses of firearms or to curb the activities of the legitimate users of firearms. That's what you call putting grease on the skids. What follows is the Communist Party line. Now, the party line is that guns cause crime. Well, that must mean that a certain kind of gun causes a certain kind of crime. So what kind of crime do you think to be caused by handguns? Handguns are supposed to be causing all the crime on Saturday night. So they've been labeled as Saturday night specials. And while we're at it, we might as well ask a question. What kind of crimes do you think are blamed on rifles? It's fairly simple. If they can take away your handguns under the label of Saturday night specials, they're going to come back and get your rifles under the label of Sunday night spectaculars. That's why we asked the question, what kind of crime is blamed on rifles? Well, rifles are going to be labeled as snipers' weapons used by assassins. And that's the reason why in the last 6, 7, 8 years, on such television shows as Mannix, and Hawaii 5-0, and especially on SWAT, almost every week, there's some guy on a rooftop with a rifle and a scope, and he's shooting somebody. It's the brainwashing. It's a very subtle form, so that rifles can be labeled as snipers' weapons used by assassins. Now let's return to the debate. You recall Mr. Liberal has just greased the skids by assuring the hunter that nobody wanted in any way to infringe upon the rights of legitimate users of firearms. He then says to the great white hunter, Mr. Hunter, our concern is about these cheap, tinny, poorly made, imported, 1995 handguns used by criminals on Saturday night. And the Liberal gets very emotional. He says to the great white hunter, no responsible spokesman for the gun lobby would claim that these guns are good for hunting. They're not good for target shooting. They're not sportsmen's weapons. These guns are made to kill people. I know he goes on with this emotionalism. The great white hunter, in his mind's eye, sees a hunk of junk, as described by this sly Liberal over here. He looks over. He doesn't feel threatened. He says to Mr. Liberal, okay. He says, now, look, it's okay to take away those little handguns, but keep your hands off my 465 Nitro Express. That's an elephant gun. We ain't got no elephants on this continent. We got jackasses. It's led to a compromise, an eensy-beensy law, to be followed by a teeny-tiny law. And you had better believe that some of these characters on television who are standing up for the Second Amendment, but doing it for the wrong reason, that some of these characters are Judas Goats. You're being horribly misled. The second lie I told about the Second Amendment is that it's a collective right, not an individual right, that is a right to keep and bear arms. No, under that concept, it means that all of us together have the right to keep and bear arms, but no individual has that right. That lie is being perpetrated by none other than the Supreme Court, and liberals just love to cite these tricky Supreme Court rulings in their favor. My contention is that even if there were no Second Amendment in the Constitution, even if the court were right, which they are not, that this is a collective right, not an individual right, we still have the right to keep and bear arms. But let's look at this concept first, about this collective right. You see, the deal is that if we all together have the right to keep and bear arms, but no individual has it, then what the government wants to do is take all the guns from the individuals and put them in a warehouse and store them up for the collective. Presumably then, if there's a crisis, if our nation is somehow threatened, we can all run to the warehouse and get our firearms. All right, let's suppose it happens. All the guns have been handed to the government and supposedly put in a government-controlled warehouse. The crisis is that one of these smart politicians in our government declares himself to be dictator. We rush to the warehouse to get our guns. You think they're going to be there? Of course not. Before you can declare dictatorship, before you can enslave the population, you must first find a way to disarm it. That's what the Supreme Court's up to. But more importantly, my friends, we say even if there were no Second Amendment, even if they were right, this is a collective right, the Constitution still protects our right to keep and bear arms. Remember how the founding fathers did it? When they wrote the Constitution, they sent it back to the states for ratification, but the states wouldn't ratify it. They said the federal government's going to be too strong. So the delegates came back with bills of rights. Oh, there were a couple of hundred separate bills of rights. The founding fathers looked at all these bills and they said, we can't pass all these things. There are too many of them. And besides, you're thinking of more and more and more. We'll be here debating forever. So they had a problem. They decided that the wise thing to do was to take the most important rights and pass them all at once as a body. Then the question came up, what about all the rights you didn't pass? And the founding fathers said, look, we will pass them all at once, including the ones you haven't even thought of yet. And they wrote the Ninth Amendment in the Bill of Rights. The Ninth Amendment reads as follows, quote, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people, end quote. The listing of certain rights shall not be interpreted by anybody to deny or take away rights which are unlisted. And for anyone to do that, for anyone to try to interpret the Constitution to take away our rights, that is the crime of sedition. Now we turn over to Article 6, Paragraph 3 in the United States Constitution. It says, quote, the senators and representatives before mentioned, and the members of the several state legislatures, and all executive and judicial officers, both of the United States and of the several states, shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution, end quote. That means that from the President to the Attorney General, to the senators, the congressmen, the Supreme Court justices, right down to your governors, your mayors, your state legislators, right down the line, that all of these men are supposed to support this Constitution. And the Ninth Amendment says the listing of certain rights shall not be interpreted by anybody, especially by these men, to take away rights which are left unlisted. So even if there were no Second Amendment in the Constitution, the Ninth Amendment protects your right to keep and bear arms. Notice, that right came from God, not from government. But you ask then, what is the Second Amendment about? Well, my friends, the Second Amendment was put in the Constitution for exactly the same reason the Constitution was written. It's put in the Constitution so that we, the citizens, could protect ourselves from the tyranny or potential tyranny of government, period. We need firearms to protect ourselves from crime and criminals, whether the criminal appears as an individual, in a group, or in the government, especially in the government. If anybody were to ask you then why you need the Second Amendment, that's the answer. And that's the one the liberals are afraid of. You see, my friends, if you start talking about an attempt on the part of men in our government to put us in slavery, if you call it a conspiracy, all hell breaks loose. But so long as you're respectable and talk about hunting, sportsmanship, and target shooting, or talk about statistics and crime, so long as you fall for that kind of nonsense, you can be a member of the responsible community. Well, my concern, and your concern, should be to retain your freedom. So I ask a question then. How do smart criminals in our government operate a protection racket the way Al Capone did? How do they do it? Well, it's fairly simple. Since the target is to say that guns cause crime, that means that somehow the men in our government must be causing crime. So we ask, how does the government cause crime? That's easy. By turning loose the criminals. By pretending that criminals are not responsible for their actions and the results of their actions. By shifting the blame to society or to economic conditions. Any kind of lies. Let's give a couple examples here. Say a man commits a serious crime and happens to be a Negro. If the judge can, the judge will turn him loose on the grounds that he's black. Well, you know how that works. The lawyer says to the judge, Your Honor, my client's a Negro. The judge says, well, what does that mean? The lawyer says, well, Your Honor, my client had been a victim of white racism for 200 years. I ain't never seen a 200-year-old Negro. If the same crime's committed and there's a white man, if the judge can, the judge will turn him loose on the ground that he's not black. If he's tall, judge say, well, everybody looked up at him. If he's short, everybody looked down on him. Give him a complex. If he's rich, well, he was spoiled by his money and never really had a chance, led a sheltered life. And if he's poor, well, poverty causes crime. If he's not too rich and not too poor, not too tall, not too short, not too black, not too white. Don't get me wrong, I have nothing against Mexicans. If they can't find any other way to turn this guy loose, they'll turn him loose on the grounds that when he was a baby, his mother didn't breastfeed him long enough, and that made him mentally ill. Which brings us to the second excuse. Claim these characters are temporarily insane. The third way of turning loose criminals is what you call lack of evidence. In this case, all you do is get the lawyer and the judge, and they keep postponing the trial until one day the witness doesn't show up, and then the case is dismissed for lack of evidence, which opens the door for the next case. Because as the trials are postponed, you get more and more trials on the docket, more and more cases to be disposed of through plea bargaining. In plea bargaining, you commit one crime, and you plead guilty to a lesser offense, and you get a suspended sentence or probation. And the last method, of course, is what they call legal technicalities. The question, you see, my friends, is not whether the judges and these liberal politicians are turning loose the criminals. The question is why. Everybody knows they're doing it. The question is, why are they doing it? And the answer, if you haven't got the message yet, the answer is to create crime. Of course. Because crime is the big guy. Just as Al Capone turned loose the big guys to terrorize the businessmen, in an exact parallel, men in high places in our government are turning loose the criminals to victimize all of us. And now you're beginning to wonder who's going to be the next victim. What's causing all this crime? You're beginning to respond exactly the same as the businessmen responded when Al Capone unleashed his violence against them. And now, you've been set up just as they were. Because when you begin to ask what's causing all this crime, over CBS, NBC, ABC, so-called documentary shows, comes a message from these politicians: guns cause crime. If there were no more guns, there'd be no more crime, or that crime would be greatly reduced. Notice how it works. You're threatened by the big guys, going to be rescued by the other guys. Only in this case, what they're after is your firearms. Take away all the freedom of the American people. I have a case here of one such sly hypocrite in our government, of which there are all too many. The speech was made April 6, 1975. Now listen to the con here and see how much it sounds like those criminals who went around to see the businessmen. Quote, "I would like to talk with you tonight about a problem that concerns us all." See, you got a problem. You say, yeah, they're big guys. Violent crime in the nation's urban areas has reached grave proportions. The problem is crime. Now people wonder, what's causing all this crime? So we turn over here, and he says, quote, "It would be comforting to know precisely what forces and conditions cause crime." Notice the Marxist ideology there, that somehow forces and conditions are causing crime. Not criminals, of course, forces and conditions. Well, I'll tell you what. If you're walking down a dark alley one night, and about 180 pounds of forces and conditions jumps out the alley and pounces on your back, get yourself a gun and shoot it. You can't be charged with murder, of course, because you can just tell the police you were eliminating some forces and cleaning up some conditions. Now, by talking about forces and conditions, he then pretends to search through all of these factors, you see, these forces and conditions, overlooking the criminal, you understand. And then he says, quote, "The handgun has become the common denominator," etc. Here's the pitch. Guns cause crime. There follows all sorts of recommendations for taking away the Second Amendment rights of the American people. Oh, of course, the target right here is handguns. Who is this man? Well, of course, he's a lawyer. His name is Edward Levi. He was Attorney General under Gerald Ford. Cicero said it best. A nation can survive its fools and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within. An enemy at the gates is less formidable, for he is known, and he carries his banner openly. But the traitor moves among those within the walls freely, his sly whispers rustling through all the alleys, heard in the very halls of government itself. For the traitor appears familiar to his victims, and he wears their face and their garments, and he appeals to the baseness that lies deep in the hearts of men. He rots the soul of a nation. He works secretly and unknown in the night to undermine the pillars of a city. He affects the body politic so that it can no longer resist. A murderer is to be less feared, end quote. That was Cicero talking about Julius Caesar. I could have sworn he's talking about Henry Kissinger. But the point I'm making here, my friends, is that a murderer, that is a dumb criminal, is to be less feared than a traitor who is a smart criminal in the government. I suggest to you, my friends, that the plan is simply to disarm the American people and leave us at the mercy of government. Men in our government are working a protection racket whereby they create crime by turning loose the criminals and then sell us gun control under the label of crime control. They want us to be dumb enough or stupid enough to hand in our guns to the government. In which case, I ask you, if we hand in all our guns to the government, what's going to protect us from the government? And don't anybody say you can trust government. The Constitution was written because the Founding Fathers did not trust government. You're not supposed to trust the government. You're supposed to watch it. The price of liberty is eternal vigilance. That is the price you pay to keep the government off your backs and out of your pockets, is to forever watch the men in government, force them to obey the law. I suggest to you we have a solution to our problem. First of all, you'll notice that the smart criminals are always organized, and their intended victims, the whole population, is never organized against them to expose them for what they are. Instead, they're divided into warring factions, so you fight amongst yourselves. So I suggest the first thing you do is to join the John Birch Society. We formed the John Birch Society not to unsell you something you wanted. We formed the John Birch Society so that men could get together, free people get together, and resist having something forced down our throats which nobody wants. Nobody wants to go into slavery. Now, the idea is to expose these men, these conspirators, for what they are. Because there's one thing no conspiracy can stand, and that is exposure. Once the people know, once the intended victim knows how the con men operate, he can take proper action, political action. Vote him out of office, you'd have impeachment, you'd have trials for treason and sedition, and that would put a screeching halt to the march of communism in America. But it requires waking up the American people. You have to simply get together, organize, and educate the American people. That is the only way it can be done. I suggest to you that when enough Americans understand what's going on, we can repeal the 1968 Gun Control Act. We should put pressure on the congressman to repeal that Gun Control Act, and we should mount a wall of opposition to prevent the Congress, for whatever reason, from passing any new gun control measures. In other words, we should say to the men in government to keep your cotton-picking hands off our firearms, just as the Founding Fathers said to them, that we know what the danger is. In terms of actual physical criminals, we should restore the death penalty and use it. As far as I'm concerned, if a man commits a serious crime, happens to be a Negro, he's convicted of it, there's nothing wrong. After a trial and a conviction and an appeal, there's nothing wrong with executing that man for his crimes. He'll just be a dead Negro, that's all. If he's a white man, he'll be a dead white man. If he's tall, he wouldn't worry about people looking up at him anymore. And if he's short, he wouldn't worry about looking down at him. If he's rich, well, you can't take it with you. And if he's poor, he wouldn't worry about poverty driving him to life of crime. And if he's not too rich and not too poor. Not too tall, not too short. Not too black, not too white. One of them so-called insane men. There is nothing wrong with executing a so-called insane man for his crimes. If he didn't know when he was killing you, he didn't even know when you're killing him. As far as plea bargaining is concerned, there's a way to stop that. I'd like to be a judge for a while. Oh, not really, you know, but just to show you how it works. Can't y'all see me on them benches with all them black robes on? Well, you probably couldn't see me, but I'd be there. Picture this beautiful scene. Here comes some lawyer coming down the aisle. He got his client with him, and he says to me, "Your Honor, Judge Smith, please give my client a suspended sentence." So I will. At the end of a rope. I'd be known as the swingest judge in town. What we need to do, of course, is to enforce the laws that are on the books right now. We don't need new laws. So let me caution you, don't back any so-called federal law for mandatory sentences for felonies committed with firearms. The reason for it is that the intention there is to strip the states of their jurisdiction of a whole category of crime, transfer it to Washington, D.C., and if you keep that process up, you wind up with your state and local governments simply being administrative agencies out of Washington, D.C. Now, it's a power grab. Never back something like that. Even at the state level, if they try to pass a law putting on mandatory sentences for criminals using firearms in a felony, all they're doing is stigmatizing the firearm. You mean it's okay for a man to rape my wife if he has a knife, and it's not all right to do it if he holds a gun to her head? No, no. It's the act, it's the crime committed, not the weapon used that counts. So don't try to stigmatize inanimate objects. Finally, I say to you that if all else fails, if we fail in the educational process, if for whatever reason, there comes a day when the government tries to take the guns by force, there are only two ways they can do it. Either we hand them in voluntarily, or they try to come and take them by force. If they try something like that, you start shooting when they come to get the guns, because you're not going to shoot afterwards. And in saying that, my friends, that is in the best possible American tradition. So let me close with the story of how this country really began. The founding fathers began shooting when the king came to get the guns. March 1775. You recall the king had put his army into Boston. They were on the ships. And the governor of Massachusetts issued an order. And the order made it so that the colonists could not buy or sell or manufacture or trade or import or export gunpowder. He had begun the process of disarming the population. He wanted to be the king over here. Patrick Henry heard about it. He went to the St. John's Church and made that famous speech. And he asked those people assembled, "Does the king have an enemy in this quarter of the world? Why are the ships out there?" He said, "No, sir, they are meant for us." He said, different people often see the same events in different lights. For my own self, I see the present crisis as nothing less than freedom versus slavery. If we wish to be free, we must fight. I repeat it, sir. We must fight. He then went on to say, "They tell us, sir, that we are weak, unable to cope with so formidable an adversary. But when shall we be stronger? Will it be the next week or the next year? Will it be when we are totally disarmed and when a British guard shall be stationed in every house?" You see, my friends, the issue then, as the issue now, was disarming the population. Will it be when we are totally disarmed? We know what happened. 1 month later, King George III hatched his plot. The plan was to slip the army out of Boston. They were going to march to Lexington and Concord, confiscate the guns, and then King George III be the king over here. Fortunately for us, there were some people around with enough common sense to know that you weren't supposed to trust the government, you're supposed to watch it. One such man was Paul Revere. You remember, according to the poem by Longfellow, Revere said to his friend, "If the British march," that is, if they come to get the guns, "if the British march, by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the north church tower as a signal light. One if by land and two if by sea, and I, on the opposite shore, will be ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm for the country folk to be up and to arm. We know what happened. April 18th, late at night, the King's army sneaked out of Boston. They muffled their oars and began to row across the river there. The lanterns were hung. Revere made that ride. He didn't finish it. He was captured by the British. But his friend did finish the ride. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he hears a guy pounding on someone's door, and a sleepy-eyed farmer would get up and go down and look, and there's this man on horseback, and all he said to those people was, "To arms. To arms. The British are coming." It was now or never, sink or swim, do or die. Most of those people went back to sleep. But fortunately for us, some of them got up out of bed, got dressed, went out and got their guns. They did their duty. That whole episode came to a head at a little bridge called the Concord Bridge, which spans the Charles River. Picture the scene. On one side of the bridge is the British Army, the most powerful force known to man at that time. It was the force of slavery. On the other side of the bridge, a handful of farmers, no different than ourselves. Well, they'd taken some rags and sewn them together, put them on a stick, and held them over their head to show that they weren't going to be slaves for the king. 100 years later, during the centennial celebration, that scene was described by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Picture it if you will. He said, "By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled, here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world." The founding fathers began shooting on the very day that the king came to get the guns. You do likewise. But in the meantime, you educate the American people. I suggest you join the John Birch Society, educate the American people, and through proper political action, stop the grab for our firearms. But if all else fails, if we should come to the point where someday some would-be tyrant approaches that bridge between freedom and slavery, if he tries to cross that bridge, when he does, as when he tries to cross it, he's going to discover that we Americans are still standing at that bridge, that more Americans are joining us at that bridge, and when he tries to cross it, he's going to find out that we have just begun to fight. Thank you very much.